Trash. The word landed harder than the crystal wine glass that trembled against the white linen tablecloth. It sliced through the soft piano melody drifting across the dining room, silenced the quiet laughter of wealthy guests, and froze every polished smile inside Ashford House, one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants. For a heartbeat, nobody reached for a fork. Nobody lifted another glass. Every eye slowly turned toward the young black waitress standing beside table 12. Naomi Brooks didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't lower her eyes. She simply held the serving tray with steady hands as though the insult belonged to someone else. Across from her sat Ethan Caldwell, a 38-year-old billionaire CEO whose name regularly appeared on magazine covers beside words like visionary, disruptive, and unstoppable. His tailored navy suit looked as sharp as the confidence behind his blue eyes. To the business world, Ethan was the man who could turn struggling companies into billion-dollar success stories before most people finished their morning coffee. Tonight, however, he looked at Naomi as though she were little more than inconvenience standing between him and another lucrative deal. "Did you hear me?" he asked, loud enough for nearby tables to listen without pretending not to. "People like you should be grateful you even get to work in a place this nice." A nervous chuckle escaped from one of his associates. Another stared into his bourbon, suddenly fascinated by the ice cubes. Even the restaurant manager stopped halfway across the dining room, uncertain whether stepping forward would make things better or much worse. Naomi offered the same calm smile she had given every guest that evening. "Is there anything else I can bring you, sir?" she asked gently. Her voice carried no anger. No fear, no embarrassment. Somehow, that unsettled Ethan more than any argument ever could. He leaned back in his leather chair, convinced her silence was surrender. Around him, expensive watches reflected the warm glow of handcrafted chandeliers, while floor-to-ceiling windows framed Chicago's glittering skyline against the deep blue evening sky. The room smelled of aged steak, fresh rosemary, and imported wine. Everything about the evening whispered power, influence, and money. Yet something invisible had shifted the moment that single word left Ethan's mouth. At a nearby corner table, an elderly couple quietly exchanged uneasy glances. A young server paused behind the espresso station, gripping two porcelain cups without realizing it. One investor discreetly lowered the phone he had been checking moments earlier and watched with growing curiosity. They had all attended enough luxury dinners to recognize arrogance. What they could not recognize, at least not yet, was why the woman wearing a simple black apron seemed completely untouched by it. Naomi carefully adjusted the folded linen napkin beside Ethan's untouched entree before taking one small step backward. There was grace in every movement, the kind that came not from practice alone, but from certainty. She thanked another guest for visiting, wished a family celebrating an anniversary a wonderful evening, and continued serving the room as though nothing remarkable had happened. Ethan smirked, believing the moment was over. He had no idea that everyone else had just witnessed the beginning of the most expensive mistake of his entire career. Naomi Brooks had learned long ago that dignity was often quiet. It did not announce itself. It did not compete for attention. It simply remained standing after everything else had fallen away. At 27 years old, she had spent more evenings inside Ashford House than inside her own apartment, greeting strangers with genuine warmth while moving through the dining room with the effortless precision of someone who knew every table, every regular guest, and every unspoken rhythm of the restaurant. She remembered birthdays without checking reservation notes. She remembered anniversaries, favorite wines, food allergies, and even which corner booth made nervous business partners feel more comfortable before difficult negotiations. Guests often believed she possessed an extraordinary memory. The truth was much simpler. Naomi believed people deserved to feel seen, especially in places where success often made everyone invisible, except themselves. The younger servers quietly admired her. When a nervous college student accidentally dropped a dessert fork during his first week, Naomi was already beside him before panic reached his face. She knelt, picked it up, smiled, and whispered that every great server had once been new. When the kitchen found itself running behind during a crowded Saturday evening, she carried extra trays without being asked, thanked the chefs by name, and somehow managed to calm impatient customers before frustration ever reached the dining room. Even the executive chef, a man famous for impossible standards, often admitted that Naomi could settle an entire room with nothing more than a reassuring smile. Yet despite earning the respect of nearly everyone who worked beside her, she never behaved as though she deserved special treatment. She arrived 30 minutes before every shift, checked every table herself, straightened every chair, and polished silverware whenever she noticed another employee falling behind. More than once, customers assumed she was simply another hardworking waitress trying to earn larger tips. Naomi never corrected them. She never mentioned that she could have spent her evenings somewhere else entirely. She never explained why every department manager greeted her with unusual warmth or why the accounting director occasionally stopped to ask for her opinion before monthly meetings. Those conversations always happened quietly, away from curious eyes, as though everyone involved understood that some things were worth protecting until the proper moment arrived. Tonight, however, the atmosphere felt different. The insult from table 12 lingered in the air like a storm cloud that refused to move on. Employees exchanged brief glances whenever they passed one another, careful not to stare toward Ethan Caldwell for too long. The billionaire continued discussing acquisitions, market expansion, and projected earnings with complete confidence, apparently convinced that the uncomfortable silence surrounding his table had already disappeared. It had not. Across the dining room, one elderly gentleman quietly folded his menu and leaned toward his wife. She responded with the smallest shake of her head before looking back toward Naomi, who was now helping a young family celebrate their son's acceptance in a medical school. Her smile looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Her posture never changed. Her voice remained calm and welcoming. Watching her, it became almost impossible to reconcile the graceful woman serving fresh coffee with the target of such careless disrespect only minutes before. Hidden beneath the crisp black apron and neatly pressed white shirt was a confidence that did not come from the approval of wealthy strangers. It came from something far deeper, something no expensive suit, impressive title, or billion-dollar balance sheet could ever purchase. And somewhere behind the polished walls of Ashford House, preparations for a private meeting were quietly falling into place. One that would soon reveal just how little Ethan Caldwell truly understood about the woman he believed he had already judged. Ethan Caldwell had built his reputation on reading people faster than spreadsheets. Investors admired his instincts almost as much as his balance sheet. Financial magazines called him fearless. Business schools analyzed his negotiations. Television hosts praised the confidence that allowed him to walk into struggling corporations and leave with controlling ownership before sunset. At 38, he had transformed Caldwell Ventures into one of the fastest-growing investment firms in the country, acquiring luxury hotels, technology startups, and restaurant groups with the same philosophy. Every asset had a price. Every person had leverage. Every obstacle could eventually be moved. Those beliefs had carried him from a modest suburban neighborhood outside Cleveland to penthouses overlooking Lake Michigan and private flights scheduled with little more than a text message. Success followed him so consistently that failure had become something he read about rather than experienced. The people surrounding Ethan only reinforced that certainty. His executive assistant anticipated every request before he spoke. Attorneys defended every aggressive negotiation. Public relations specialists carefully polished every interview until confidence looked like leadership instead of arrogance. Over time, compliments became expectations, and expectations quietly became entitlement. Somewhere along that journey, Ethan stopped noticing people whose names were not printed on conference room doors. Waiters became background. Valets became routine. Receptionists became invisible. He never considered himself cruel. In his mind, he simply focused on what mattered most. Tonight, Ashford House represented another opportunity waiting to be added to an already impressive portfolio. The historic restaurant had become one of Chicago's most profitable dining destinations, attracting influential executives, professional athletes, respected politicians, and celebrities who preferred privacy over publicity. Its financial performance had exceeded industry expectations for nearly 5 consecutive years, making it one of the few independent luxury restaurants that larger hospitality groups had failed to acquire. Ethan intended to change that before the evening ended. Across the polished walnut table, his associates reviewed confidential documents while discussing projected expansion into New York, Dallas, and Miami. One partner pointed toward the framed photographs decorating the walls, each capturing decades of culinary awards and community recognition. Another mentioned that the restaurant's anonymous ownership had puzzled analysts for years because no interviews, magazine profiles, or public appearances had ever identified the person responsible for its remarkable success. Ethan smiled with quiet satisfaction. Anonymous owners rarely stayed anonymous after acquisition offers large enough to attract attention. He believed that money solved hesitation the same way sunlight dissolved morning fog. If the owner refused once, he would simply increase the number until refusal became impossible. Confidence filled every sentence he spoke. Every prediction sounded inevitable. Yet while Ethan discussed percentages, valuations, and future renovations, subtle details escaped his attention. The hostess glanced toward the private hallway before checking the elegant watch on her wrist. The executive chef personally inspected each dish leaving the kitchen, although the dinner service was nearly complete. Department managers quietly gathered near the back office instead of heading home after their shifts. Even several longtime employees appeared unusually composed, almost expectant, as though they were counting the final minutes before something important began. Ethan noticed none of it. His attention remained fixed on contracts waiting inside a leather portfolio beside his chair. He believed the evening was unfolding exactly according to his plan. What he could not see was that the most significant decision of the night had never belonged to him at all. The final dinner plates disappeared as the evening settled into that rare moment when a luxury restaurant seemed to inhale before midnight. Soft conversations replaced the earlier buzz of arriving guests. Crystal glasses caught the golden light from the chandeliers, reflecting tiny stars across polished marble floors. Somewhere behind the kitchen doors, fresh coffee was brewing for the last reservations of the night, while the aroma of butter, roasted garlic, and warm bread slowly gave way to the rich scent of dark espresso. Naomi moved through the dining room with the same calm rhythm she had carried since the beginning of her shift, thanking each departing guest with genuine appreciation. To anyone watching, nothing about her suggested that the evening had become unusually personal. She smiled at an elderly couple leaving hand in hand. She helped a young father retrieve his daughter's forgotten sweater from the back of a chair. She congratulated another table on closing what sounded like an important business agreement. Every interaction carried the same quiet kindness, as though the unpleasant exchange from earlier had never happened. Ethan, however, had not completely let it go. As he signed a final page of a preliminary proposal, he noticed Naomi passing nearby with an empty serving tray. His confidence returned almost immediately. "Excuse me," he called, loud enough for nearby executives to hear. Naomi stopped and turned politely. "Yes, sir. I have been waiting for fresh coffee for nearly 10 minutes." His tone was smooth, but the edge beneath it was impossible to miss. Naomi glanced toward the cup in front of him, still nearly half full. "I would be happy to bring you a fresh cup whenever you are ready." Ethan smiled, although there was little warmth behind it. "See, that is exactly the problem. Nobody here seems to understand urgency anymore." One of his associates shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another quietly looked toward the restaurant manager, expecting him to intervene. Instead, the manager remained perfectly still, his expression calm but unreadable. Ethan noticed and interpreted the silence as agreement. "If this were one of my companies," he continued, Employees who failed to anticipate simple expectations would not last very long. The words drifted across the room, and conversations at nearby tables gradually faded. Naomi kept her posture straight. "I appreciate your feedback, sir. Nothing more. No defense. No excuse. No irritation." She simply acknowledged his words with the same composed professionalism she had shown every guest all evening. That response somehow irritated Ethan more than disagreement would have. He had spent years negotiating against people who raised their voices, defended their positions, or attempted to match his confidence. Naomi did none of those things. She gave him nothing to overcome. Around the dining room, employees quietly resumed their work, but many were watching through reflections in mirrors, polished glass, and stainless steel serving stations. They had seen difficult guests before. They had witnessed demanding executives and impossible celebrities. Yet tonight felt strangely different. There was no panic behind the scenes. No whisperkemplants. Instead, an unusual calm settled over the staff, almost as though everyone already knew how the evening would end. As Naomi walked toward the service station, the maitre d' approached her discreetly and leaned in just enough to speak without disturbing the room. "Everything is ready," he said softly. Naomi gave a small nod and checked the elegant watch on her wrist. 8:55, exactly on schedule. She placed the empty tray onto the service counter, smoothed the sleeve of her uniform, and looked once toward the private hallway beyond the dining room. Behind those closed doors, a meeting was about to begin that would determine far more than the future ownership of a celebrated restaurant. It would quietly reveal which person in the building truly understood the value of respect. Naomi stepped through the discreet door, leading toward the private corridor without looking back, leaving the soft glow of the dining room behind her. The familiar sounds of polished silverware and quiet conversations faded with each measured step until only the muted hum of the building remained. She paused briefly beside a framed photograph that had hung in the hallway for years, showing the restaurant on the night it first opened its doors. The picture reminded her of a promise made long before anyone in the city had ever heard the name Ashford House. It had never been about becoming famous. It had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had always been about creating one place where every guest felt welcome and every employee felt respected. Behind her, the evening continued exactly as scheduled. Ethan Caldwell glanced at his watch and closed the leather portfolio containing his acquisition proposal. "It is almost 9, he said confidently. "I assume the owner understands the value of punctuality." One associate smiled politely, while another checked the meeting agenda that had arrived earlier that afternoon. The invitation contained very few details. Private investment discussion. Executive dining room. 9 o'clock sharp. Owner in attendance. Ethan appreciated the mystery. He believed it gave him an advantage because surprises rarely unsettled him. Throughout his career, he had entered boardrooms filled with skeptical investors, hostile competitors, and experienced negotiators, always convinced that preparation and confidence would eventually win the room. Tonight felt no different. Across the restaurant, several longtime employees quietly finished their final responsibilities with unusual precision. The hostess straightened the front desk one last time before locking the reservation book inside a drawer. The executive chef removed his apron, exchanged it for a tailored charcoal jacket, and headed toward the same private hallway Naomi had entered moments earlier. Department managers followed one by one, each carrying folders instead of serving trays or kitchen towels. None of the guests seemed to notice the subtle transformation taking place around them. To outsiders, it simply looked like another successful evening winding down. To the employees, however, the night was only beginning. Naomi entered a quiet office illuminated by warm lamps instead of fluorescent lights. A garment bag hung neatly beside the bookshelf. She unzipped it and revealed an elegant cream-colored business suit that contrasted sharply with the black uniform she had worn all evening. Carefully, she folded the apron that countless guests associated with ordinary service and placed it inside a wooden cabinet. There was no dramatic expression on her face, no satisfaction, and certainly no desire for revenge. She simply prepared herself for the next responsibility waiting on the other side of the hallway. Leadership, she believed, demanded consistency more than recognition. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. The restaurant's legal counsel stepped inside with a welcoming smile. "Everything is assembled," he said. "The board is waiting whenever you are ready." Naomi thanked him, collected a slim leather portfolio from the desk, and reviewed several documents with practiced confidence. Revenue reports, expansion plans, partnership proposals. At the very bottom rested Ethan Caldwell's acquisition offer, untouched except for a small handwritten note clipped to the front. She read the note once, smiled almost imperceptibly, and closed the folder. Meanwhile, Ethan stood from his chair as a senior staff member approached his table. "Mr. Caldwell," the gentleman said courteously, "the meeting is ready. If you would please follow me." Ethan buttoned his tailored jacket, adjusted his cuff links, and exchanged confident glances with his associates before following the employee toward the private corridor. Every step carried the certainty of a man expecting another successful negotiation. He had no reason to believe the next door he opened would challenge every assumption he had made since walking into Ashford House earlier that evening. The executive dining room was nothing like the elegant restaurant outside. There were no chandeliers competing for attention and no carefully arranged tables filled with guests. The space was intentionally understated, lined with walnut paneling, framed architectural drawings, and shelves displaying decades of awards earned through consistency rather than publicity. A long conference table occupied the center of the room, surrounded by men and women whose expressions reflected experience instead of ceremony. Some were investors. Others were attorneys, financial advisors, and senior executives who had quietly helped shape Ashford House into one of the most respected independent restaurants in the country. As Ethan Caldwell entered with his associates, several people greeted him politely before returning to quiet conversation. He immediately noticed a leather folder placed neatly in front of every chair, each bearing the restaurant's embossed crest in deep gold. At the head of the table, however, one chair remained empty. Ethan assumed it belonged to the owner. He glanced toward the presentation screen mounted on the far wall, where a simple welcome message displayed the evening's agenda. Strategic partnership review, long-term growth planning, ownership discussion. Nothing about it appeared unusual. Ethan smiled to himself. This was familiar territory. Numbers, projections, negotiations, and leverage had always been his strongest language. He took his seat with relaxed confidence and leaned toward one of his associates. "This should not take long," he whispered. "Once they see our expansion plan, they will understand why joining us is the smartest decision they can make." Before anyone could respond, the room gradually fell silent. The chief legal advisor stood and offered a brief welcome, thanking everyone for honoring the invitation before introducing several board members seated around the table. Ethan nodded politely as names and responsibilities were presented. Chief Financial Officer, Director of Operations, Executive, Chef, Community Relations Director. Every introduction reinforced the professionalism of the organization he intended to acquire. Then the attorney smiled and glanced toward the closed entrance. "There is one final member we are waiting for," he said. "She prefers to finish every evening serving our guests before attending any executive meeting. She believes leadership begins on the dining room floor, not inside a boardroom." Ethan barely reacted. The statement sounded unusual, perhaps even symbolic, but he dismissed it as another example of sentimental management. A soft click echoed through the room as the door slowly opened. Every board member rose to their feet almost immediately. The executive chef stood. The financial officers stood. The attorneys stood. Even longtime investors who rarely displayed emotion straightened with genuine respect. Ethan remained seated for one brief second, confused by the sudden formality. Then he turned toward the doorway. Naomi Brooks entered the room wearing an elegant cream-colored business suit, carrying the same slim leather portfolio she had quietly collected only moments earlier. The confidence in her stride was identical to the calm she had displayed while serving dinner, but now every detail surrounding her made perfect sense. There was no apron, No serving tray. No hosetasjen. She acknowledged each board member with a warm smile before taking her place at the head of the table. Only then did Ethan slowly rise from his chair, his expression shifting from certainty to disbelief. His eyes searched the room for another explanation, another owner, another executive who might walk in behind her. No one did. The attorney spoke with quiet clarity that required no dramatic emphasis. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. It is my privilege to introduce the founder, majority owner, and chief executive officer of Ashford House Hospitality, Ms. Naomi Brooks. For the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell discovered what true silence sounded like when every assumption he had carried into a room quietly collapsed beneath the weight of a single undeniable truth. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The silence inside the executive dining room carried more weight than any prepared presentation ever could. Ethan Caldwell remained standing, his fingers still resting lightly against the back of his chair, unable to reconcile the poised executive before him with a woman he had dismissed only minutes earlier. Naomi Brooks acknowledged each member of the board with quiet confidence before taking her seat at the head of the table. She did not look victorious. She did not appear interested in anyone's embarrassment. Instead, she opened her leather portfolio with the calm focus of someone beginning another ordinary business meeting. "Good evening, everyone," she said warmly. "Thank you for staying late." The room answered with respectful smiles and nods. It was immediately obvious that this was not respect inspired by wealth alone. It had been earned over years of leadership, consistency, and trust. Naomi reviewed the evening's agenda with practiced efficiency, discussing quarterly revenue, employee retention, customer satisfaction, and plans for future expansion into several major cities. Every board member participated naturally, building upon her observations with detailed reports and thoughtful recommendations. There was no hesitation when they addressed her, no uncertainty about who guided the conversation. Ethan listened in complete disbelief as executives with decades of experience sought her opinion before making recommendations. The executive chef described a new culinary partnership. The chief financial officer summarized another record-breaking quarter. The director of operations praised recent investments in employee education and leadership development. Again and again, every discussion returned to Naomi for the final decision. She listened carefully before speaking, asking thoughtful questions instead of delivering quick answers. More than once, she thanked someone else for an idea that strengthened the organization. Ethan had attended hundreds of board meetings throughout his career, and one truth slowly became impossible to ignore. This was authentic leadership. It could not be manufactured by public relations consultants or purchased through expensive branding campaigns. It existed because people genuinely trusted the person sitting at the head of the table. Finally, Naomi turned one page inside her portfolio and looked toward Ethan with the same calm expression she had worn while serving dinner. "Mr. Caldwell," she said politely, "thank you for your interest in Ashford House. We reviewed your acquisition proposal before tonight's meeting." Ethan quickly gathered himself. Years of negotiation had taught him never to reveal uncertainty for long. He cleared his throat and offered a measured smile. "I believe our offer presents an exceptional opportunity for everyone involved. With our resources, this brand could expand nationwide within a few years." Naomi nodded thoughtfully. "Your projections are certainly ambitious." She glanced briefly toward the financial reports before returning her attention to him. "However, our board has already completed its review." Ethan waited confidently for the inevitable discussion about valuation, ownership percentages, or revised terms. Instead, Naomi gently closed the proposal folder. "We have decided not to pursue a sale." The sentence was delivered without hostility, disappointment, or satisfaction. It was simply a business decision. Ethan blinked in surprise. "May I ask why?" Naomi folded her hands on the table. "Because our long-term vision cannot be measured only by growth. We built this company around a culture where every guest matters, every employee is treated with dignity, and leadership begins with respect. Those principles are not negotiable." Her words were calm, yet every person in the room understood the deeper meaning behind them. Ethan felt the memory of his own behavior return with uncomfortable clarity. For the first time in many years, no financial projection, persuasive argument, or impressive reputation could change the direction of a meeting. The room had already reached its conclusion long before he realized what was truly being evaluated. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that no spreadsheet could measure. Ethan Caldwell had entered the room expecting to negotiate from a position of strength. Instead, he found himself quietly examining decisions that had once seemed insignificant. Naomi did not linger on the uncomfortable history they now shared. She moved naturally to the next agenda item, reviewing plans for opening 2 new locations while preserving the standards that had made Ashford House successful. She spoke about investing in employee training, expanding scholarship opportunities for hospitality students, and creating leadership programs that promoted talent from within rather than searching endlessly for outside executives. Every proposal reflected the same philosophy. Great businesses were built by people who felt valued long before they produced remarkable results. As the discussion concluded, the board unanimously approved the next phase of expansion. Several members congratulated Naomi, while others exchanged ideas for the months ahead. The meeting had accomplished exactly what it was designed to achieve, and not once had anyone raised their voice or celebrated another person's discomfort. Ethan remained seated for a moment after everyone else began collecting their documents. He looked toward the acquisition proposal resting unopened beside Naomi's portfolio. For the first time in years, losing a business opportunity felt less painful than understanding why he had lost it. The opportunity had not disappeared because of unfavorable market conditions or financial limitations. It had disappeared because character had entered a conversation where he expected only numbers. As board members gradually left the room, Naomi thanked each person individually for their contributions before gathering her own notes. When only a few people remained, Ethan finally stood and walked toward the head of the table. His confident stride from earlier in the evening had been replaced by something quieter, something far more genuine. He stopped several feet away, leaving enough space to show respect rather than authority. "Ms. Brooks," he said carefully, "before I leave, there is something I need to say." Naomi looked up with the same calm expression she had shown throughout the evening. "Of course." Ethan took a slow breath. "When I walked in your restaurant tonight, I believed I could judge someone's value in a matter of seconds. I saw a uniform and assumed I understood the person wearing it. I was wrong." The room remained completely still. No one interrupted him. No one rushed the moment forward. "I spoke to you in a way that did not reflect the kind of leader I believe myself to be," he continued. "There is no professional excuse for that, and there certainly is no personal one. I'm sincerely sorry." Naomi listened without triumph or resentment. She had heard many apologies throughout her life, some offered only because circumstances demanded them. This one sounded different, not because it erased what had happened, but because it acknowledged the lesson behind it. She offered a small, thoughtful smile. "Thank you for saying that, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before looking back at her. "You could have revealed who you were the moment we met." Naomi gently shook her head. "If respect depends on a title, then it is not really respect. I wanted to see whether kindness would be offered before recognition was earned." Those words settled quietly between them. Ethan realized that the most valuable lesson of the evening had never been hidden behind contracts, investment strategies, or ownership documents. It had been standing beside his table from the very beginning, offering nothing more complicated than courtesy, while asking for nothing in return. As he left the executive dining room, he carried no signed agreement, no new acquisition, and no victory to announce. Yet he left with something that had been missing from his leadership for far longer than he had ever recognized. The last lights inside Ashford House grew softer as midnight approached, leaving only the warm glow that reflected across polished wood, quiet dining tables, and windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. The restaurant had almost emptied, yet its heartbeat remained steady. A few employees laughed quietly while finishing their closing routines. The kitchen staff exchanged grateful words after another successful evening. The hostess carefully locked the front doors before wishing everyone a safe trip home. To an unfamiliar visitor, it would have looked like the end of another ordinary night. Those who had witnessed everything understood it had been anything but ordinary. Ethan Caldwell paused outside the entrance before stepping toward the waiting town car. For the first time in many years, he told his driver that he needed a few more minutes. Instead of opening his phone or reviewing tomorrow's schedule, he looked back through the tall glass windows. Inside, Naomi had changed back into the same simple uniform she had worn earlier that evening. She was helping a young employee stack chairs, carrying folded table linens, and thanking every member of the closing staff before they left. There was no audience watching her now. No investors remained to impress. No board members were present to applaud her leadership. Yet she treated every person exactly as she had during the executive meeting. Ethan finally understood something that had escaped him for years. Leadership was never a performance. It was a habit practiced when nobody important seemed to be watching. Several weeks passed. Business headlines continued to celebrate successful mergers and major investments. But those closest to Ethan noticed subtle changes that never appeared in financial reports. Receptionists were greeted by name. Restaurant servers received the same attention as executives. Meetings began with questions instead of assumptions. During one leadership conference, Ethan surprised an audience of young entrepreneurs by speaking less about valuation and more about character. Without mentioning names or locations, he described an evening that had permanently reshaped his understanding of success. The easiest mistake a leader can make, he told the audience, is believing that titles reveal value. They do not. Character often wears the simplest uniform in the room. Meanwhile, Ashford House continued to flourish without sacrificing the principles that had guided it from the beginning. Employees remained longer than industry averages because they felt respected. Guests returned not only for remarkable meals, but because they remembered how every person, regardless of appearance or background, was treated with genuine dignity. New restaurant locations. Opened carefully, each carrying the same culture Naomi refused to compromise. Before every grand opening, she repeated one sentence to every newly hired employee. People may forget what was served at their table, but they will always remember how someone made them feel. That belief quietly became the company's greatest competitive advantage. One crisp autumn evening, nearly a year after their first encounter, Ethan returned to Ashford House alone. There were no associates, no contracts, and no negotiations waiting inside. He requested an ordinary table, thanked the host, and enjoyed dinner without drawing attention to himself. As he prepared to leave, Naomi happened to walk through the dining room. Their eyes met briefly, and both smiled with the quiet understanding shared by people who had learned something valuable together. No speeches were necessary. No apologies remained unfinished. Respect had already completed the conversation months earlier. Some stories end when the truth is revealed. The most meaningful ones begin there. Wealth can open remarkable doors. Power can command impressive rooms. Reputation can attract endless attention. But none of those things can replace the simple decision to treat another human being with dignity before learning who they are. Because in the end, the strongest measure of character is not how someone treats the powerful. It is how they treat the person they believe has nothing to offer them.